Police in London have discovered a body locked in a freezer.
We have to identify who that person is. The concerns you have is, are there any more victims, and where is this suspect?
There might be a serial killer out on the loose with maybe more bodies that have yet to be discovered.
The crime scene holds the story of the murder.
This person needs to be found before anything like this happens again. And so the forensics and exhibits become crucial to help us find the killer.
A woman has called the police, concerned for the welfare of her friend.
A local lady, a churchgoer in Canning Town, had befriended a person who was quite down on their luck, and this person turned out to be Zahid Yunus. He had given her lots of stories about being homeless, not having money to feed himself, and was vulnerable. Zahid Yunus had told this lady that he had Crohn's disease, an illness that can be quite debilitating in quite a quick period of time. She had taken him on as a kind of a project, and she had started to give him money over the course of a few months in respect of helping him. It came to a point where Zahid Yunus was due to meet this lady, and he hadn't turned up. And when he didn't turn up to meet her, she's become concerned that, well, perhaps he hasn't met her because he's ill. She's gone to his flat, where he said he'd just moved into. She's knocking on the door, she can't get any answer. So she was quite right to feel concerned for his safety, quite right to call the police.
Worried about the occupants' welfare, officers force entry via a window.
Hello, police. Police officer, make yourself known. Hello, police.
You can see in that flat, it's in quite a bad state. A lot of items strewn about.
Oh, I know.
And it becomes clear almost immediately Zahid Yunus isn't there. The officers try to establish where he might be, looking for things like hospital letters or doctor's notes, something that would indicate he may be somewhere else. The officers see this utility cupboard. They move all the items out the way, open the door, and there in front of them is a chest freezer.
There's a freezer here that I want to get into, it's locked.
And then notice there are some flies around. The officer sees that freezer locked and has a hunch that he wants to open the freezer. And so that's what they do. The officer initially sees lots of material, lots of white sheets, and he notices something just quite close to him that looks a bit unusual. When he moves it, he realises that it's a human foot. He quite quickly realises that what he has inside that freezer is a body.
The flat of Zahid Yunus has become a crime scene. The police need to determine if it is his body inside the freezer.
We have to identify who that person is, and that information will be vital as quickly as possible. Because if you can understand and know your victim, you have a good chance to understand why they died. And that leads on to who may have killed them as well. The lady that called in about Zahid Yunus and concern about his welfare was very quickly ruled out as a suspect. She had never been inside the flat. She did not know anything about Zahid's family, friends, colleagues.
The CSIs begin the forensic harvest of the property. Sarah Thurkle has 30 years' experience in crime scene management and is one of the UK's leading CSI instructors.
There's a huge amount of pressure from the investigating officer, the SIO, to determine who's in the freezer. So as a crime scene manager, you have to build in the expectations of the SIO within your strategy, so they're not expecting an identification and result within 2 or 3 hours, which might be normal in a normal crime scene because you can fingerprint them or do visual identification. If it's a body that's tucked into a freezer, they're going to be waiting for confirmation as to whether the body is actually male or female. Is it a child? Is it an old person? Is it the occupant of the flat? My main priority is to preserve the evidence around the freezer. I would immediately be thinking of contact trace evidence, DNA swabbing, the handle of the freezer, fingerprinting the plug where it's been plugged in, so the electricity supply, the lock that was on the freezer, so who locked that lock, and then also we would fingerprint the outside of the freezer. There's several different powders that you can use as a crime scene investigator. On a freezer handle, the best powder to use will probably be black powder because of the slightly textured surface. Fingerprints are made up of sweat and amino acids and water, so the powders would actually adhere to these contaminants, and it's where we can identify the actual ridge detail of a fingerprint. This is then lifted off using different types of tape, which is almost a bit like sellotape, and the sellotape actually sticks to the powder and then sticks to the ridge detail where the fingerprint's been and lifts the mark off. Because there was flies within the flat and interest of the flies around the freezer, it was important to get an entomologist in order to preserve any maggot and fly infestations so that we could potentially use that evidence to prove how long the body's been in the freezer for.
Dr. Carl Harrison was brought in to assess the freezer and its contents.
Insect activity under those circumstances might assist with giving an indication of time of death, but that would be made more difficult by the fact that they had been stored in the freezer. If we had a colony of early development larvae, maggots, then that would be an indication that there would have been a period of delay during which time the body would have been laying out, would have been subject to fly colonisation, and those eggs of the flies would have had time to hatch and develop. And we don't see that. The lack of entomology associated with the remains, it suggested a fairly rapid deposition within the freezer environment. Whatever else has happened within the flat, the actual freezer contents represent a mini crime scene in themselves. So if that can be removed from the flat in one go and then dealt with in a controlled area, that will allow an optimal recovery of evidence from it.
There's lots of things that go through your mind. Are there any more victims? And where is the person that's done it? This person needs to be found before anything like this happens again. And so the emphasis turns to the forensic science inside that crime scene to help us find the killer.
Officers from the Metropolitan Police have discovered a body locked in a chest freezer. Fingerprints and DNA swabs were taken from the freezer before it was transported to the mortuary, so that it can be defrosted in a sterile environment.
If you think about large things in your home freezer, it takes a long time for it to defrost. Human bodies kept in those same circumstances are exactly the same. In order to promote a natural thawing so that all of the tissues can be examined as part of a post-mortem examination, that takes an incredibly long period of time to get to the very core of the body and have it defrosted.
Once the freezer's been processed and removed to the mortuary, then it's a slower time investigation with regard to what other evidence is within that flat. At this stage of the inquiry, the victim in the freezer's identification is not known, so it's really important for the CSIs within the scene to try and ascertain who else had been within that flat. CSIs would be processing items within the flat. They would be swabbing surfaces, door handles, drawer handles, any obvious DNA that's at the scene. They'd be fingerprinting different items.
And there's lots and lots of fingerprints were taken from inside. You're talking about all over the bathroom, the hallway, the front door, the kitchen. You want to see who you can place via a fingerprint inside that flat. It helps you identify potential victims, potential witnesses, and also movement of people as well. A real priority is to identify who is in that freezer. You couldn't make any form of positive identification that they were male or female. So there's a lot of emphasis on knocking on doors and speaking to people. We want to know anything we can find out about the flat itself, who lives there, who comes and goes. It became apparent that Zahid Yunus was looked at as a problem in his community. He shouts, he screams, he's abusive, he doesn't care about anybody else. I mean, he's a very dislikable person. He has a number of contacts, leads a very transient lifestyle. So it'd be expected that people would go into that flat. So there could be other people, one involved or responsible or as witnesses.
A request is made for Yunus's police records as the CSIs continue to search for clues as to who is inside the freezer and who may have put them there.
Within the scene, there was a lot of different items belonging to several different females. There were different forms of identification and clothing. Really important for all this to be recovered because you never know what bit of evidence is a crucial piece of evidence.
I'm starting to think, well, why are all these women's details inside this flat? Who are these other females? Are they in any danger? Have they come to harm already? And the inquiry starts straight away with that. Right, go and find these women as quickly as possible. And that's when you start to identify there is a particular person's handbag and contents. Inside there is a blister pack of medication with the name Mirshan Mustafa, and that person is a missing person.
Mother of two, Mirshan Mustafa, known as Jan, was reported missing 11 months ago. Her cousin Aisha and other family members have been searching for her ever since.
I set up a Facebook page, printed out posters. Me and her sister would go out in the evenings. We did put ourselves in danger sometimes going to places where we shouldn't have been going. It's nearly a year. There's no sightings, there's no clues. Where is she?
They had worked tirelessly to try and find her, but the family had no luck around that. And we're getting to the stage now where the body's in that state where we can start to make identifications.
Confirming the identity of an unknown set of human remains is absolutely crucial to an investigation moving forwards. With highly decomposed remains, where all of the visual features are lost in decomposition, that's a real challenge. In this instance, there was a lack of soft tissue decomposition. Visibly, all of those traces, facial features, tattoos, are still present. So that allows for a relatively early intelligence identity to be fed into an incident room.
We know Mirshan had tattoos, which were distinctive. You look at the description that's been given, the long dark hair, and that seemed to fit what we could see of the body inside that freezer. You're deciding then, do I tell this family that we possibly have their daughter, their sister, their mum inside that freezer?
We had a visitor from the police. They said 99% they think it's Jan. We just broke down crying. We like cuddling these strangers, crying our eyes out. It was heartbreaking.
You have to prove it is that person. To make it formal, they provided DNA themselves.
The familial DNA samples are a match to the victim in the freezer.
We were able then to identify formally Mirshan Mustafa.
I got a call from the liaison officer confirming it was Jan. I've had my cry in the kitchen, I've quickly wiped my eyes. I sat her two children in the bedroom telling them. I'll never forget that image of the two cuddling and crying. It's one of them images you can't get out of your head. It was heartbreaking, it was really hard. Jan was my cousin, we were best friends. Growing up, we had the best time together. Got so many happy memories. She was really funny, so bubbly, had a beautiful, really big smile, and she was really loud. From East London, really cockney as well. Her sister lived in a block of flats, so she'd always come up and the first thing she'd shout is, "Oi, oi!" You'd know she was there before she'd even turn up. Her passion was teaching children dance, and she loved it. She loved kids, but her family was her number one. Her kids were her everything. She dressed them up so lovely. She was such a proud mum.
Now police have confirmation the body in the freezer is not Zahid Yunus. They analyse his police records and history.
The previous convictions and allegations made against him over the years are very, very serious. He is a very, very violent, manipulative domestic abuser, and he's a registered sex offender. Officers are working through all those names inside the flat, and we've got to the point now where we know and we have traced these people and they are safe and well. These women were very forthcoming because they knew he was very, very violent towards women, and this is now a situation where I'm thinking, we've got to get him as quickly as possible. Are there more victims? Somewhere else, perhaps?
The results from the fingerprints on the freezer are in, and they belong to Yunus.
Just because there's fingerprints on the outside of the freezer, it doesn't necessarily mean, in a court of law, that Yunus disposed of the body within the freezer. It's good circumstantial evidence, but it doesn't prove any crime has been committed.
Within that elevation into suspect status, you start to get more resources and more focus into trying to find him as quickly as possible. You have CCTV officers dedicated to a huge trawl area around here. Start looking to see if you could find a camera on the front of that flat, but there wasn't one. Look at the two ends of the road, because once you get past there, it's a needle in a haystack. And also you are juggling that with the timing. You don't know when this has happened, and that was particularly difficult. So you've got to look at other ways to find him. Does he own a vehicle? In this particular case, Zahid Yunus used to, but didn't at that particular time. We could see his call data, but it didn't help us identify where he was at that particular time when we needed to find him quickly. Officers are looking at where he hangs out, his friends, associates, where he might pick up his benefit money. All those kind of things form that strategy and that plan to find him.
As the pressure intensifies to find Yunus, there is an update from the mortuary.
Inside the mortuary, we have the ability to scan the freezer, so it's x-rayed within the state that it was when it was taken out of that flat. And then shockingly, I get the phone call to say, you won't believe this, but there's a second body inside that freezer underneath the one that we can see.
I've dealt with a lot of bodies over the years. This is one of the very few examples of a double storage of bodies. The topmost body was wrapped and folded against herself because it wasn't a very large freezer, so it was impossible to see the body below. As a result of that, you end up with a whole load of other logistical issues that need to be dealt with in order to ensure a successful examination.
We then have discussions about how can we get the bodies firstly outside the freezer and then separated so that identification of the second body can be made as quickly as possible. Officers are working through all those names inside the flat, and we've got to the point now where we know and we have traced these people and they are safe and well.
Detectives turn their attention to other evidence contained in the flat.
The numbers of ripped up piece of paper and photographs inside that flat was vast. There was bags of it. So officers in my team took those items back and started to lay them out on huge tables to try and almost start a jigsaw and piece together what they could see. And now another name starts to appear where we can't find this person, called Henriette Sukes. We need to know who is this person and where are they, and they're pretty much the only one left at that time we can't trace or even identify. But now you have to try and say, right, is this person Henriette? Intelligence showed that she was a victim of quite a serious domestic abuse case. The nature of that crime meant that Henriette had to submit her own DNA, and because of that, we now had a sample to compare against the body that was still defrosting. We were able then to identify formally the body on the bottom was Henriette Sukes. The intelligence suggested that there was a female stopped with Zahid Yunus in August of 2016, and an officer in the intelligence team found the officer who 2.5 years before had stopped Zahid Yunus to see if they still had their original notes. Fortunately they did, and in their original notes named Henriette Sukes, and that's what we knew about her. up to August 2016, when she completely disappeared off the radar. And I started to think, you can't tell me she's been in that freezer for 2.5 years. And this is now a situation where I'm thinking, am I looking at a serial killer here?
DNA tests have confirmed that Henriette Sooks and Mirisha Mustafa are the 2 women found locked in a freezer in East London. A manhunt is underway for the occupant of the premises, 36-year-old Zahid Yunus. Sonia Lynch runs the Welcome Centre in East London and helped Henriette when she'd fallen on hard times.
When I found out about the tragic news, I felt just absolute disbelief. How could this have happened to Henriette? The general feeling of the community was shock. Henriette came into the day centre like many others. She was always very positive, bright, smiling, really, really pleasant to be around. She liked to draw. She did a drawing for me, which I kept, and I have. We did sessions together, we cooked together, and we have loads of pictures of Henriette at that time, focused and engaged in sessions, smiling. She shared a little bit about the fact that she had children, and she started to talk about her aspirations, wanting to get her documentation, her passport sorted so that she could start to move forward and get work. We actually lost touch with Henriette 2015. She said that she had found somewhere else to live. The last we heard about her was when another client mentioned the fact that she was in hospital, that she'd been thrown out the window. But that's all we heard. We didn't know where she was. He didn't have a contact number for her.
She had gone to hospital and then she had been taken to a women's refuge. And we wanted to understand a little bit how she's got from there into what is essentially a place of safety for her, into Zahid Yunus' flat as one of our victims. And so you look at what has happened. Zahid Yunus had targeted her at the hospital after her domestic abuse case with somebody else.
Whilst I don't know for sure, I would imagine that she would have been feeling that he would be somebody that may look after her, protect her. And if somebody is showing kindness and something that looks like it might be love, you would go towards that. People can be deceived. It's something that happens to a lot of people because we don't really know what their motives are.
Zahid Yunus was a name unfamiliar to those who knew both Henriette and Mirishan.
We've never heard of him. We don't know this flat, and it's literally a minute away from her mum's house. He's opposite the shops that we go to all the time. Like, her mum's in that shop every day. The kids are in there every day. And I always said my gut feeling was always she's local. I knew she was close.
Young single mother of 2, Mirishan, got into financial difficulties and struggled to pay her rent.
One day she got a letter in the post saying that she was going to be evicted from her property. It built up that bad. Her and her children moved to her mum's in Custom House, which is where her mum lived at the time. The friends that she started to mix with in that area, they weren't nice people. Things just got from bad to worse. Alcohol, drug addiction. From the amazing working mum, she just didn't want to get up, she didn't go to work, she just started losing weight. I think at the time she went missing, she was about 5 stone. We'd then found her diaries when she went missing. Every single diary is a cry for help. I want to go to rehab, I want to get better, I want to get better for my kids, I want them to be proud, I don't want them to see me like this. She was weak, she was very vulnerable at the time. And he preyed on her. She was an easy target for him.
The vulnerability of the women involved here
gave Eunice an opportunity to be able to control and coerce and manipulate them. One could draw a conclusion. The dependency that the victims had on the Class A drugs provide a convenient tool for Eunice to be able to control them further. They would have entered a cycle of interdependence, addiction, requiring the drugs, and therefore it would have had another input into why they would have stayed and needed to stay.
As the search for Eunice intensifies, DCI Harding finally gets a breakthrough.
Intelligence comes in about family members. We had teams out looking for them, and in particular in this case was to focus into his brother's address, which was also in London. And we waited. Zahid Yunus appeared out of the front door, was formally identified by one of the officers watching that premises. A big guy, he didn't want to come quietly, but there was enough officers there to eventually arrest him and take him into custody. He decides to say nothing when he's interviewed, but that's very difficult to say nothing when you have a flat of which you are the sole occupant and there are two female bodies in a locked chest freezer inside your flat. Zahid Yunus was 6'4" and he's a big guy. And you see intelligence that he's got a nickname Boxer, considered himself to be a strong man, somebody who could fight. When you're talking about somebody that frame and that size, against what you could see of our two victims, they are petite women, small frame. They would have stood no chance against somebody of that size, with that propensity for violence, and you can understand why they suffered the injuries that we could eventually see they suffered during their time with Zahid Yunus. Henriette had around 58 different injuries on her body, severe head trauma and trauma to other parts of the body as well. And she had all the ribs down the left-hand side were pretty much broken. Mirishan Mustafa, she had internal injuries, serious compression to her neck, some broken bones in her sternum, and she also had a number of ribs broken on her left-hand side.
Many of us would simply find it insurmountable to carry out such acts of violence. For offenders that have a history in this way, violence can become quite habitual. We can find that violence increases in severity and frequency over time, and ultimately and sadly this can lead to very serious injuries or fatal consequences.
It was clear that the pathologist could not give a categoric cause of death to either of the bodies due to decomposition, and it was difficult for the pathologist to give that indication, especially because the bodies had gone through the process of freezing and then thawing out. Henriette for some 2.5 years and Mirishan Mustafa for just under a year. If you don't have a cause of death, then it's very difficult to actually categorically say at that stage that person was murdered. They may have fallen ill and he's just put the body in the freezer. It seems out of our normal thought process to think like that, but that's a worry for me as an SIO, because I think, well, hang on, are we going to get enough to actually keep him in custody? You do not want somebody like him back out on the streets. So you have to look at alternative ways to keep him in custody and not release him. And one of those was the offence of preventing a lawful burial. The CPS agreed, and we were able then to keep Zahid Yunus in custody whilst we try and prove what is the priority offence of murder against both of the girls. And so the forensics and exhibits at the crime scene become crucial to help us prove that he is the killer.
With Eunice held on remand, DCI Harding and his team pay their respects to both Henriette and Mirishan.
Henriette's family were in Hungary. They don't have a lot of money and they couldn't repatriate her back to Hungary. And through some amazing work done by my team, they managed to organise a funeral in London, and we had some amazing support with that, where we had some flowers donated, we had an entire funeral service for her, a cremation, everything was free, so we were able to get a vicar who donated his time. We had order of service, and myself and a few members of my team were there as the congregation. Henriette Sukes had been through such a terrible time in the UK, and had been physically abused and emotionally abused by Zahid Yunus and other people. So it was very, very important to take her home. We took the ashes ourselves back to Hungary and gave them to the family, where they then buried the ashes in the local town. It was nice to be able to bring them back together again and lay her to rest in her home country, where they can go and her children could go to pay their respects to her when they wanted to.
We done a GoFundMe to raise money for the funeral, and it was amazing, like the amount of help and support. So many strangers, because the story really touched so many people, and they could see how much of a loving, beautiful mum she was. And obviously they heard what tragedy had happened. She had beautiful white horses with pink feathers, horse and carriage. I wanted her to go into the cemetery as our princess, and I wanted her last journey to be special.
Each a white dove in memory of Mary Jane.
Fly free.
Dozens of fingerprints were taken from the apartment, and the forensic officers have another match. A fingerprint found on the cooker belongs to Mirishan.
The fact that Mirishan's fingerprints have been found on the cooker would intimate that she's been alive and moving around within that scene, rather than placed in the freezer as a dump site for her body.
Zahid Yunus says he's never met her before, never seen her before, never been to his flat. When you have a fingerprint on a cooker, it's a live person who's inside your flat. So that really knocked his story out of the water.
The forensic harvest of the property produces even more compelling evidence.
Underneath the sofa was Mirishan Mustafa's mobile phone. When you analyse phone data, it gives you a lot of information, but essentially after a year it can drop off. We were quite fortunate that Mirishan Mustafa hadn't been missing quite 12 months. We managed to get her call data before it fell out of the system. And what you see then is the week that she went missing, one of the last people she called was Zahid Yunus. And that links the two of them together almost at the point where she disappeared.
DCI Harding is confident he has enough evidence to charge Yunus for the murder of Mirishan. But the detectives still need more to charge him for the murder of Henriette.
As the forensic examination of that flat continued, you could see that there had been new wooden flooring been put down in the flat.
Suspicion is always aroused if there's signs of redecoration, recent painting, the smell of bleach, anything that looks unusual for the flat.
When you do a search around the outside, each one of those flats had its own small shed, essentially, outside. Inside this shed was a large amount of cut-off carpet that had come from inside the flat. And that became highly significant forensically for us, because when that carpet went to the lab, you could see blood staining over that carpet.
Blood is very difficult to clean up, especially on a carpet. It's quite thick, it will get into the weave. It's really difficult to be able to remove. There's been a violent attack. And even if it is cleaned up, it could potentially be found with chemicals like luminol or fluorescent light sources to be able to determine if there has been a clean-up of a crime scene. You'll be able to identify that there has been blood there previously. The tests proved that all the blood on the carpet belonged to Henriette Souks.
Once the flat had been cleared and the carpet had gone through its forensic testing, we put the carpet back into the flat in the room that we believed it went into, and it fitted perfectly. And then you could see the pattern around, the movement around the flat. Because her injuries were external bleeding injuries. You could suggest that she had been assaulted on a number of occasions and was bleeding as she was walking around that flat.
Scientists reassemble the torn pages of Henriette's journals, which tell a harrowing story of the abuse she suffered at the hands of Yunus.
You could see words that were concerning about potential abuse, potential harm that she'd come to. And as officers started to build that, you saw her making pleas inside these bits of paper, saying, "Please don't hurt me anymore. and also bits of paper where you had her name plus Zahid's name. So you had that link together with the two of them. Once you're in with someone like Zahid Yunus, there's no way out, because he is that person that traps you in. He promises you things that he never delivers on, but at the same time he is coercing and controlling you to the point where you can't go anywhere.
Often in controlling relationships, the controller encourages the women to break ties with others and further isolate themselves from others. And in this way, they're less likely to be detected or known to be isolated by potential networks of families and friends.
Sometimes I find generally if you don't know what your worth is, sometimes you do put up with things that you really shouldn't, and very unkind and very ugly.
And what he says goes as well. If you cross that line, he will use violence against you.
DCI Simon Harding and his team have collated enough forensic evidence to bring Zahid Yunus to trial for the murder of Henriette Soukes and Mirishan Mustafa, whom were both discovered locked in a chest freezer inside his flat.
When he saw the family all sitting together, he was just staring, just constantly looking. It did get a bit intimidating at one point, so he was told, don't you just look forward and that's it. He'd pretend that he's all religious, he'd be sitting there with his Quran book, and I'm thinking, like, have you got a nerve holding that book after what you've done?
Zahid Yunus initially presented himself as this innocent person who's been caught up in a criminal fraternity. He basically says that Henriette Soukes, he came home one day and she was dead on his sofa. So he sat there and just thought, what do I do? And he rings a colleague of his who says, well, if you ring the police, they're going to think it's you. So the best thing to do is go and buy a freezer and put her in it. For Mirishan Mustafa, didn't even know who she was. He was called to a flat some 2 years later after putting Henriette in the freezer. And as he walked into the flat, there was a female body on the floor. He was told that if he didn't take that body and put it in the freezer with the other body, that they would tell the police that he had a body in his freezer. And this was his story, and they said he was essentially being blackmailed to do that. When we presented the evidence of, well, Mirishan Mustafa's fingerprint is in your kitchen, he said, well, the police have planted that to stitch me up. We had evidence there were relationships with both. He was seen with Mirishan Mustafa by a local shopkeeper. He had evidence inside the flat that he had an abusive relationship with Henriette Soukes. So all this was presented to the jury. When he's hearing something that makes him feel uncomfortable, his true colours start coming out. He becomes more arrogant, more like a petulant child. He can't stand that kind of pressure because all of a sudden he's no longer in control. And that's when he's out of his comfort zone. You know, he was verbally abusive to the female judge, and she shut him down very quickly, but you could see this is part of his feeling towards the female. And that's seen by the injuries that he commits on not just Mirishan and Henriette, but some of the previous victims of domestic abuse that came forward and very bravely gave evidence during that trial. And you could see the true colours of Zahid Yunus, what kind of person he is, a very, very dangerous person.
He'd been in and out of prison. He's a sex offender. He's done so much, but you Google him, there's no history on there. So for any other victim that had met him, there's nothing about him. And we just feel like these men are protected so much more than vulnerable women, and that's why things happen all the time.
Many of the witness statements indicated that Yunus would make threats against their family if they didn't listen to him or follow his instructions.
We think he threatened her that if she was to disclose anything that had happened, he would go and kill her mum and children. So to protect her family, she stayed, because there's similarities with another case that we've heard that he done that to another family.
It demonstrates a distinct callousness and element of wanting to be in control.
After a tense and emotional trial, the jury finally reaches its verdict.
It was a bit of a nerve-wracking time because it actually took 5 days for the jury to come back. And as an SIO and as your team, you're invested in that case so much, and you worry slightly that you've missed something.
After 5 days of deliberation, the jury finds Eunice guilty for both murders.
My hands are clenched, waiting for them to say those words, and as soon as they say guilty, the blood comes back to my hands again. I remember looking at the family and watching how emotional everything was for them, and you're more than pleased that this violent, abusive monster who has no respect for anybody, and especially females, he has been seen for what he really is.
It was a big relief. He was sent down, and within 20 minutes we come back up for sentencing, and he wouldn't come back up again. So that was the last time we saw him when he was found guilty.
He didn't even have the decency to stand there and take his sentence. He just stayed in his cell, essentially like a coward. It's all about everybody, not just the police, but it's the family, it's the community that came into that investigation and helped where they could.
In his absence, Eunice was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 38 years.
38 years is a very long time. It's still never enough for someone like this. People would look at this case and look at Zahid Yunus, a registered sex offender, being allowed to associate with women. There are designated units that look after registered sex offenders and do the monitoring and visiting, but you simply cannot be there 24 hours a day. It's not an excuse, but what it is a reality check on the number of police officers against people like that are in society. And that those that are a very, very high risk are dealt with very differently to those that are a medium and a low risk. Unfortunately, in this particular case, he wasn't a high risk at that point. It's horrible to think of, and for the victims' families, it's been very difficult to understand that.
We don't like to force people to talk about their difficulties. Since then, since that's all come about, we will be much more alert, or just to perhaps delve that little bit deeper to see if they are fleeing from something, to see if they need more protection.
Things have to change sometimes. There's lots of things that can come out of this, lots of legacy, lots of information that policing and other agencies can take forward to use this as a case to say, right, how can we really change things for the better after the Zahid Yunus conviction.
Everyone says the trial's ended now, she's laid to rest, that's it, get on with your life, but you can't. Until you're in our shoes, it's not finished. It's still not real, and it doesn't stop. Sometimes it still doesn't even hit me that it's even happened. Stand there and look at the picture, but it doesn't feel like it's her. You expect her to run round the corner, or you'll see her next week or something. It's don't know, it's still not real. It ain't hit me yet. I just think I'm just glad that she's at peace and away from all the horrible people that was around her. She went through a lot, and most of the time she kept it to herself. She didn't tell no one. And the only way we found out what she'd actually been through was from reading her diaries. And it's heartbreaking, like them books to read, they just break you. She's been through so much. She wrote in her diaries, I want to help other people. She wanted to do articles in a magazine. She wanted to raise awareness that these things can happen. Like, you meet someone, you think they're nice, but people target vulnerable people. If you're in a bad place, you've got to be so careful. So I think because that's something that was truly in her heart and she wanted to do, I want to take that and I want to carry that for her. You need people to talk. If people are scared to talk, you're not going to know what's going on. You need to have a voice, and I am Jan's voice. I want to start going to schools to start raising awareness. It's a very dangerous world out there, and Jan fell into the trap of this horrible man with Henriette, and look where we are today. We should be out enjoying the sun, playing music, having a drink, having a laugh, but instead we're here today, and it's wrong. And that's because this man, he had done so many things for years, and he carried on doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it until he ended up killing 2 women. And that's not fair. I think if Zahid was monitored properly at the beginning, we wouldn't be here today.
Detectives are on the case of another killer at the crime scene, brand new next Thursday at 9. And with more true crime coming up tonight on 5 Star in Murdered by My Husband next.